this evening because it's really awesome that you came out in this weather. So, I mean, not only up against weather, but up against New Year's parties. Might still be a little early for that, but it was really very nice of you to come out. So I hope this will be something of interest and a way to maybe have some new insights on things which we also really kind of take for granted. The name of the class is called What's in a Name? And the answer is everything. And so we're going to analyze the concept of what, as Jews, we think of a name. We're going to talk a lot about very fascinating Talmudic sources that address this concept of what a name is, and maybe learn a lot about it from the Gemara and from the ideas on how it actually works with our own lives. I was actually trying to remember the name of, maybe you guys can help me because I'm having, when I was younger I had like senior moments, now I have like senior video clips, they're like even longer than just a moment. But there was a guy, I think his name was Frank White. Frank White from the New York Times. Anybody remember this man? Frank White from the New York Times was very close with Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and Richard Nixon. He is the guy who brokered Richard Nixon's famous trip to China. And he wrote an autobiography. And he talks about as a child growing up as an Orthodox Jew. And he married a woman who was an Orthodox Jew somewhere in Brooklyn. They lived in a little ground floor apartment in her parents' apartment. And slowly whittled away their Judaism. And as he's writing about this, he says, however, the one thing I couldn't really ever do was I could never eat pig. Somehow, that they got down so deep, I couldn't uproot that. And so now he's talking about it's after the Communist Party's having a big celebration, and he is the guest of honor, and they're in Beijing, and Zhou Enlai is next to Mao Zedong on the other side, and the room is filled with hundreds of generals, and this is the way. Nobody eats, of course, until the guest of honor has the first bite, and he says, coming down towards their table was the biggest pig he ever saw in his life. It had like a watermelon in its mouth, it was so big, right? And he is like freaking out. He's like thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So he turns to Zhou Enlai and he says, listen, he says, I got to tell you something, I'm Jewish. And we Jews, in Chinese it's called Yotairen. You know, we Jews, we don't eat pig. And so Zhou Enlai thinks for a minute, he says, no problem. Here we call it duck. So the question really becomes, right, what is a name? Is a name something which is merely a label? And as long as you and I speak the same language and we agree that that label is what it is, but there's no intrinsic relationship to the item, such as, well, if pig's not the right word, then duck is okay. Or is it like the Medrash says, when Adam was called to ask the animals' names, he actually was able to perceive their actual inner being, right? Because if you look at creation, creation begins with talking about God spoke and it was. Well, obviously God doesn't have like these Mick Jagger yaya lips out there, and every time he speaks, things are coming out. What is really happening? It means that we know that in physics, the difference between a gas, a liquid, and a solid is molecular movement. So the speed of an item is actually what creates part of its composition. So Qabalah, God speaking, is what's setting vibration among the molecules, of course, just as a metaphor, which then gives it its tangible form. So what Adam was doing was coming along with spiritual stethoscope and putting it on the side of a dog and hearing kelev. He was actually able to hear not an arbitrary label externally applied to an item, but the actual divine name, which was the basis through which this entity's life sustained itself. Agav, in Chulin, Tosfos asked the question if Adam also named the fish, which is kind of a classic good Tosfos question, but I don't remember his answer. Anyhow, but the point is that this idea, therefore, when we look at names, names are really something that reflects something very deep inside of us, and that'll be the second half of the class. I want to begin with something as a primer to getting to that idea. And that is, as I mentioned, the reason we're doing this class tonight is because it's the idea that we begin the new book of names, of Shemot. And therefore, I wanted to show you something I was once taught that I found really very interesting. If you're familiar with the idea of fractal, so fractals are a concept where, depending on altitude, you can see the same lines at incredibly different heights, but they all reflect one of the other. And so therefore, in Torah levels of knowledge, there are fractal levels. There's the simple pshat of understanding where something is. You could go deep, deep inside into the Kabbalistic understanding of the crowns on the letters, or actually the letters themselves are made of other letters, and so on and so on. Or you can come out the other way and suddenly see a topography view of something that's really incredible. In fact, I don't know why, but I just remembered 1986, I was a teacher at yeshiva, and during that time, there were a group of computer scientists, and I remember 1986, okay? Computer scientists that were visiting from Silicon Valley, and we hung out with them, and they wanted to do a Jewish something, 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 and they had no idea what to do. So I came up with an idea, and we actually did this. I'll just tell you briefly. We coordinated every letter in the alphabet to a color. And then we induced inside, we set the spectrum of the screen so that the screen contained every single letter of Bereshis to the end of the Sefer Torah. So, right, so basically what we did is on a single screen, we put the entire Torah, Chumash, on the screen with color coordinating all of the letters. And guess what? I mean, not 100%, but let's say 83.65%, it came out looking like a shofar. It was really an amazing kind of a revelation. So there are all these ultimate levels of revelations. Here's a level of revelation, and that is that the 5 books of Chumash actually are a primer or an algorithm to the meaning of life itself. And that's what I'm going to start with, and after we do that, of course we'll have Shemot as one of those 5 names, then we'll come back to the actual individual relationship to name and the power of what a name is. So Bereshit, if you look at the word Bereshit, you actually can see in there this kind of cryptic algorithm of Be, Rosh, in the head is the letter Yud and Taf. Right? So the beginning of everything is in one's mind. Everything is about wisdom. I remember there was a joke, which I'll have to edit out of the video later, but there was a joke of Moses comes along and he says to the world, the answer to everything in the world is in your mind. Comes along another Jewish cousin named J.C. Johnny Carson, and he says, really? No, it's all in your heart. You just have to really believe. And then comes along Karl Marx and says, no, it's like in the stomach, and we'll stop there. But anyhow, so Moshe comes along, it's called the decline of mankind. Moshe comes along and says it's all in one's mind. Through one's wisdom, one can understand the entire universe and simultaneously their own particular purpose for being alive. This simultaneousness is the letter Yud, which we'll see is the personalization of each of us, our own uniqueness in this world, and the collective reality that we all live within the fabric of what creation is all about, and that's the letter Taf, right? The last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So there's a kind of a mystical allusion to the idea of the beginning of creation in Bereshit, as in one's mind. And the Gemara Avodah Zorah also says that another word for Sefer Bereshit it's called the book of the straight, or the book of the upright. Sefer HaYashar is the actual language, because it tells the story of people who were upright and who were straight. And so therefore these people, what we call our Avot, these are the people that we learn about in Bereshit. They show us how to deal with all of these problems in our lives, and how through having faith rooted in wisdom, not blind faith, although Eric Clapton had a great band, but really faith rooted in wisdom, that gives us ability to override and supersede everything we see. In fact, the Gemara Chagiga points out, I just quote it in English, the existence of time is connected to God's 3-letter name. So we see that even the fabric of time itself is rooted in the idea of name of God. We'll talk a little bit about later the difference between the concept of God versus the idea of names of God. But again, the elements of creation, even including time, are rooted within the concept of name. What's the last word in Sefer Bereshit? I don't feel bad asking this because you just heard it last week. Judaism for 20. And Egypt, Mitzrayim. And they put Yosef's Aron in Egypt. So what do we see from this? The Shalach HaKodesh writes that in every Parsha HaShavua, I'm not going into the Parsha, don't worry, but in general, every Parsha Shavua, the idea which is the beginning and the idea of the end is the resolution of the concept of the beginning. There's something about a very intimate relationship between the beginning and the end of the Parsha. In fact, this goes even deeper, and I'll jump for a minute. Those of you who might be familiar, since we're talking about the Shalach, there are many people who have the tradition of saying the pasuk that relates to your name. So if your name is Gedaliah, So you'll say, Golal Hashem derechecha v'atach alav v'hu ya'aseh. Why? Because the first letter of the pasuk begins with Gimel, which is the first letter of Gedalia. The last letter is Hey, which is the last letter of Gedalia. So therefore, there's something about this pasuk, which people say 3 times at the end of the Shemona Esrei, which mystically, when a person dies and goes to the next world, before they can finish the sentence, what the, right? And they are like completely in shock, they can actually go into amnesia and forget who they are. But if they have said this verse through their life where it's deeply embedded, this verse magically opens up your name. And your name is kind of like the matrix code that allows you to access your own personal reality in the next world. So again, this idea of beginning and ending in connections happens in the 5 books as well. The first one is Bereshit. God created at the helm. What did God create? He created Egypt. Because as we know from the pasuk in Shayahu, which we say in our davening every morning, although we change the language so that we don't flip out, the real language is, right, God creates darkness and he makes, he creates the darkness, he shapes the light, he shapes the light, he creates the darkness, he makes peace, and he creates evil. What's the pasuk? And we of course say everything. But if you look at the verbs of the 4, the only 2 that use the word create is darkness and evil. So the only thing that God creates, Qabalah, in this world is darkness and evil. What is darkness and evil? What do we refer to it as? Egypt, right? Mitzarim, uptight, blind, ruled by, as the Arizal says, the foul mouth, Peh Ra, right, who's the ultimate ego, and therefore the denier of who is God that I should recognize him, and so on and so on. So therefore, this world is a creation of darkness, it's a creation of hara, it's a creation of tragedy, and it's also a creation of opportunity. Because this is what distinguishes us from angels and robots. Because we live in such a dark world that if we can, as servants of God, bring light and wisdom into this world through correct living, we can actually rectify this world. And if we can rectify a world of darkness, that's much greater than what angels rectify a world of light. Because this is, so to speak, the furthest point from God. This, by the way, I find it just a side point, but I find a lot of times in the Baal Tshuva world a lot, there's this kind of like fascination, which I understand totally, and I include myself with like Kabbalistic, woo-woo-woo, esoteric sort of ideas, because they're so out there. But if you really want to know what's really out there, the ultimate out there is what's God's Qabalah, right? What like freaks out God? Woo, right? So God's Qabalah is Pashat Pshat. It's simple life in this world. It's one person being nice to another person. That is mind-boggling. Because that's so far from God, so to speak. And because it's so far from God, that still so far from God, people, after the Holocaust and all we've been through, will wake up in the morning and still put on tefillin and say Shema Yisrael. That's mind-boggling. To God, there's nothing more incredible than that. And it's reflected, I find, in a really cute story, which I'll say b'kitzur, of these 3 Hasidim who are arguing over whose Rebbe was greater, humbler. And each one is telling the miracle of this, oh, my Rebbe this, and my Rebbe that, and finally gets down, yeah, well, my Rebbe took his gartel once off while he was crossing the river, and he could walk on it across the river, and so on. And as this is happening, a student of the Chavetz Chaim comes by and says, yo, gotta tell you, my rabbi is greater than all your Rebbes. And I said, what are you talking about? Our Rebbes, whatever they say, God does. And he says, yeah, you know what? By me, whatever God says, my rabbi does. So the reflection is about the service of God. How to be able to bring that down into this world. So this becomes the challenge of what Egypt is all about. Once we are here in the world of opportunity, how do we begin to operate? Well, we come to the book of Shemot. Now we come to the level of names. We know it from Chazal. Abaya says in the Gemara Brachos that the beginning of wisdom, which is why we put Havdalah in our first blessing of our personalized blessings for wisdom. We put in there the brach of Havdalah, because wisdom is discernment. It's to know the difference between gold and fool's gold. And therefore discernment, wisdom, is all about being able to identify something. And the ultimate aspect of really being able to identify something is by understanding its name. When you have the ability to call something or identify something by its name, you actually have a certain shlita, a certain bayalut, of management, control over what that entity is. Now, the thing about a name, however, is that a same item can have multiple names, right? The same person could be daddy, he could be grandpa, he could be honey, he could be bozo, he could be all these different names depending on who's calling him. And depending on who's calling him, that's basically what face he will show. So if he hears like, yo, buddy, he's going to turn around one way. And if he hears, yo, mama, he's going to turn around another way, right? But the point is, it's still him. But it doesn't change who he is, it just changed the nature of the interaction based on the name. This is one idea behind the idea that God has multiple names. It doesn't mean, God forbid, that there's any more than one God. It simply means in the multiplicity of the way that we live in this world, the way we access different powers in our relationship to God is through various names. It does not change, God forbid, the nature of God, but it changes our nature and how we are able to live and work with God. And even beyond God, in a sense, meaning in the more mundane world, there are also more multiple names. Gemara talks about Moshe had 7 names, King Hizkiyahu actually had 8 names. There are all kinds of people and individuals who the more dynamic their personality, the more complex their facility that they had in their lives, the more names they would have. Right? The Gemara in Sukkah talks about the Satan has 7 names. All of these things of names are because they're dealing in different levels and in different aspects. Okay. So, when a person therefore comes to the idea of being able to identify a name, we now come, what is the last word in the Sefer Shemot, which I don't expect you to know because we're still a couple of weeks away, or actually you heard about 11 months ago. But the last word in Shemot is, and will be, all of their traveling. All of the traveling. Because the Shemot that talks about the traveling, I think it's 45 places, I forgot now how many places the Jews traveled. Baal Shem Tov says that each person in their own life travels the same amount of places as the Jews in the desert. And that idea of the Jews in the desert was not merely like a National Geographic special about where they went. It was a very deep key formula that as you understand what each one of those places actually were about, you can identify them in your own life's experience and be able to make a correlation and learn a lesson from what they dealt with, how we dealt with as well. Because there's nothing new under the sun. There's always the ability to learn from history. And that's what that becomes all about. So therefore, what happens again, we now have this idea of being able to identify names. And what are the most important names to identify? The place in our life. How can we name the events we went through in our life? That was the worst thing that ever happened to me when ABC. Oh, that was an amazing time when I DEF. To give names to the places gives us control over our lives. You know, I remember once somebody said there are 2 ways to count the Omer, or to count days, if you will. One way is you can simply count your days going by. The other way is you can make your days count. So this is, it says by Abraham, it says when Abraham was old and he came with all of his days, the Zohar says that if you asked Abraham, what did you do in your life? It would take him the same amount of years to tell you. Because there would be no way to like shrink it down. Because he lived in every single second. No second was the same, so therefore he had a different kavanah, different thought, different action. He just lived like perpetually on fire, completely alive. Every second of life, meaning, connecting, tikkun. There was no like, yeah, I don't know, you want to get a brew? Right? It was just all about living, complete living. So if you asked Abraham, what did you do with your life? He would say, I lived, and I made my days count, and here they are. I've got them, and I can tell you what I did in this place, and what I did in this place, and what I did in that place. So this is the lesson of Shemot. To be able to know something by its name means you can identify it. And once you can identify it, that which we must identify the most is our lives. What could be more important than understanding what our lives are? And anyhow, we're going to be taken into account for them. So it's nice to kind of, I always found, I don't know about you, but I was not one of those like, natural born guru geniuses. So I actually had to prepare for tests in high school and college. And I found when I did, I breathed better and I scored better. And when I didn't, I was like total freak out mode, trying to always sit next to the Chinese person because I knew that if I copied from them. But anyhow, the point is that you really gotta prepare. We have to learn the lessons of what life is. Once we learn, we come to the 3rd book, Vayikra. Now that we know, in a sense, of the yud and the tuf, which sits within our head. Again, the yud, as we'll explain a little bit later more, is me per se. The tuf is Torah, of the fabric of creation. But it's all I understand wisdom. I'm turning on the light, and now that I turn on the light, I see what things are. Vayikra is now I call out to them. Now begins interaction. Now begins the way I interact with my world around me. And this is the hide and go seek of the big Aleph and the little Aleph. The little Aleph, uniquely known in the first word of Vayikra. Everybody knows this whole thing. Moshe didn't want it to be written at all. God wanted it to be normal, and therefore they compromised because of Bilam, but that doesn't really matter. The point is, if you look at the way a pei is written in a Sefer Torah, right? Pei is the Hebrew letter which relates to the word peh, which is mouth. So I just happened to bring one with me. If you, it's funny, I went to the dentist today. She said, "Did you remember your teeth?" I said, "Yeah, but I forgot my signature." Anyhow, so if you look at the letter pei, so if you look in a Sefer Torah carefully, it kind of looks like a little bit of a mouth. And if you look even more carefully, the black fire on white fire, the space inside the letter pei, you will not see this in modern Ivrit. You have to look at the way it's written in a Sefer Torah, Lashon Kodesh. It's the letter bet. The letter bet is actually written by the line of the peh around it. So the Zohar says that the peh represents God's mouth. When God's mouth, so to speak, obviously it's all metaphor, when God's mouth is open, it reveals the letter bet, which stands for bayit, which is Beit HaMikdash. It's the temple. In other words, with the ultimate expression of God's mouth opening up the Ratzon Hashem in this world, is that there should be a place in this world where God lives in this world among all of us. And that is that letter bet. However, the Zohar says when we don't hear the will of God, when we are deaf, God forbid, to the name of God, to the voice of God, then it becomes the nachash, the snake, and it closes the mouth and destroys the Beit HaMikdash. So it's the snake where the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, or it's Ratzon, will of God, where the Beit HaMikdash is standing. Kidding. Anyhow. So this idea, therefore, of Vayikra is that now God is calling out to us. This is the Medrash. The Gemara says that a bat kol goes out every day from Mount Sinai, meaning to say that the Sinai revelation actually occurs every single day anew. This is the idea that the Torah should always be new for a person, not Yiddish NU, but rather English NEW. It should always be new because it's always happening, and we have to learn how to hear. The problem is not the transmission. The problem is the reception. To be able to get the cholesterol out of our neshamas, to be able to hear what God is trying to communicate with us. That's why the last word in the book of Vayikra is Har Sinai. So it goes Vayikra all the way down to Har Sinai. This is the center book of the Torah. So this is now, again, Bereshit in my head. I'm able to identify things by their names. I'm able to now interact by communicating. And preferably, the ultimate task is to connect to Har Sinai, so everything I communicate opens the mouth of God, which leads towards the third and final Beit HaMikdash. The fourth book is Bamidbar. This is the book that was kind of introduced to many people in my generation by Simon and Garfunkel in the song Sounds of Silence. Bamidbar, in the desert, on a horse with no name. Maybe that might have been a better reference. But the idea of Sound of Silence is because a Medrash says, why did God bring the Jews into the desert to give the Torah? Why didn't he bring them to Muncie? And the answer is, because, wasn't that funny? And the answer is, okay, so then it was. So the answer is, because in the desert, you can tune out all the other noise. You know, I always like to say on Parsha Shavua of Noach, that imagine you're Noach, you watch the whole world be destroyed, and according to one commentary, in the window, God held Noach's face in the window, so he actually had to see everybody die. He couldn't just be, aloof. And now, after this whole horrible thing and the smell, and finally the boat ends and it opens up, and opens the door, and misty, moldy, whatever, and kind of like the way the Christians do it, that little beam of light comes down through the cloud, like on him, and now. What's the first thing God says to Noah after all of that? All of that. What's the first thing God says to Noah? He says, now that I have your undivided attention. So sometimes in our lives, we make so much noise we can't hear anything. And God forbid it takes something to crack through our lives till we suddenly go, whoa, 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 what is it that I really should be hearing? And what happens is that this world is a halal. The Maharal talks about that a lot, that there's a void, it's a vacuum. So because we feel that lack, that emptiness sometimes in our life, or a need to, am I really getting any? Am I succeeding? Am I growing? Am I the same person now I was 5 years ago? In that case, well, what did I do with these 5 years? We create noise, things of zero value. I'm going to tell you this, you're going to hate me, but Star Wars is meaningless. I hate it. Somebody had to do it, sorry. But it's meaningless, and the meaning that's subscribed to it is a terrible tragedy of how empty our world is. Besides, the effects weren't that good. Anyhow, but the point is that really what happens is we make noise. We make nothingness into important things just to feel that we're fulfilling our lives until one day we wake up and say, what? You know, a friend of mine was the chief psychiatrist at Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York, where unfortunately you should never know from it. And he had these very important people from all around the world. And he told me that one guy was the ringmaster, Barnum and Bailey. One guy was from SoftBank in Japan. One this, that. He says all cultures, all people, all types. He said no matter who they were, I never heard one thing from anybody. Nobody ever said, ooh, I wish I had spent more time at the office. So when the noise goes away, we see, whoa, what's really worth listening to? So there's a term that we use in our prayer in Uvo L'Tzion, where we use a term called Rash Gadol, a great sound. What is Rash Gadol? It's the numerical value of 613. Because it's the mitzvot. They make the sound that lasts forever. These are the sounds that are heard in the Yeshiva Shyamala. These are the sounds that reverberate throughout the heavens. That's the real Rash Gadol. And therefore, that's part of what we need to connect with, is we go into the Bamidbar in order to tune out that sound to hear the voice of God. And that's why the word Bamidbar are also the letters Daber Bam, speak in them, which we say in Kriya Shema. As the Vilna Gaon points out, the word Bam in them is Bet the Bereshit and Mem of Memotai. The first word of the written Torah, first word of the oral Torah. So speak in them, speak in the written and the oral Torah. Daber Bam, speak in them. So the word midbar is that opportunity to now, okay, Vayikra is a kind of an interaction, but a deeper level of communication is daber, is to be able to speak, to really communicate clearly, and to communicate on those things which really bring out that noise of true value in the world. Which is why, what's the last word in the book of Bamidbar? It's the city name of Jericho, Yericho. What is Yericho? Yericho, physically, as we know, is the lowest spot in the world, right? The Dead Sea. And so therefore, it becomes, in a certain sense, not only the physically lowest spot in the world, but spiritually it was the most decadent spot in the world. It was the Canaanite capital of the confederacy of all the other Canaanite nations. That's why they sent the spies to Yericho, because in Yericho they could learn about what every other country they were going to fight during the war of the conquest of Israel, what they were up to, and they could get a pulse. It's like going to Washington, D.C., right? If you wanted to take over the United States, you probably wouldn't send a squadron of people to Skokie, right? You'd probably be much better off if they went to Washington, D.C. I don't know, maybe something's going on in Skokie, but probably want to send it to D.C. So Jericho was the D.C. of Canaan. We all know the famous story of the sound of the shofar after the 7 days, and the 7 times, and then 7 on the Shabbos, caused the walls not to fall, that's the non-Jewish version, but the walls of Jericho sunk, because they were actually built in a way where they couldn't fall, so they actually sunk into the ground. But the point of it is that the Gemara tells us that when they burnt the Ketoret in the Beit HaMikdash, when the incense were offered in the temple, the power of the smell of the incense was so strong that we go all the way to the city of Yericho, where, according to some commentaries, the name Reach, smell, is where the word Yericho comes from, because they said you could still smell the Ketoret. But this is a very deep idea. The Ketoret was the last service of the day in the temple. And the idea of smell is the most spiritual of all of our physical senses, which is why I say Ruach HaPeinu. that through the power of smell is the power Mashiach will use. In New York, we used to say you could smell a rat, right? So the idea of smell means you could smell where somebody is at. So this idea of Reach and Ketoret ties in also with Mordechai, who was, his name Mordechai comes from Ketoret, and he was teaching about the Ketoret when Haman came, and that was the turning point from the horrible to the miraculous story. But anyhow, this whole idea of the Ketoret represents, I won't go too much more into this, the messianic fulfillment of the world. So to be able to take the Reach of the Ketoret from the temple, that it should even permeate in the lowest of the lows of Jericho, this is spanning the ultimate gap. This is even more than the beginning of the creation of the world as being Egypt. It's now the final battle, which is the battle for holiness in the Holy Land, that relationship. And then based upon that, we come, of course, into the next book of Devorim. Devorim as items. Meaning, you have speech as daber, and then you have devar as a thing. So the idea is now in the final book, or the final stage of the evolution of what the Chumash is teaching us in the process of our life, is to be able to be toho koboro, as you are on the inside, as you are on the outside. In other words, what you say is what you do. And what you say and what you do is what happens in the world. To take something from the concept of idea, bring it to thought, express it properly, and make it happen into the physical world. This is Devarim, in the physical world. What's the last word of Devarim, which everyone knows because it's actually the last word of the Torah? Israel. Because the idea of Israel being in the land of Israel, Israel in the land of Israel, opening up God's voice for the whole world to hear with the Beit HaMikdash, this is the physical fulfillment of the spiritual concept that God created. Sof Maseh is the Machshava Tchila. That which was the beginning of the idea is the manifestation in that level of Israel. Which is why, I'm sure you've heard this before, the name Israel is an acronym for all of the Avot and the Imot. Every name of all of the Avot Imot is in the name Israel. I see some faces that haven't heard this, so I'll do it quickly. You have the Yud, which is Israel and Yaakov if you want. You have the Shin, which is Sarah. You have the Resh, which is Rachel. You have the Aleph, which is Abraham. And then you have the Lamed for Leah and, who did I miss? Rivka with the Resh also, right. Anyhow, so all of the Avot Imot, their names are contained in the word Israel. So this is that idea as well of the manifestation that began in the book of Bereshit, which is called the book of the Avot, comes to the fulfillment in the word Israel. And just a little side point, because it's very beautiful. Therefore, now you have gone through the whole process of the Torah. But what completes, what links it back into a cycle? Now if you take the last letter of the last word and you connect it to the first letter of the first word, it spells heart, lev. Because for all of this to happen, you've got to have your heart in it. It's not an intellectual, cerebral thing to be Jewish. It's got to permeate every part and every organ of your body, where the heart brings the ahav, the love of Yahweh et Hashem, Yahweh Elohecha, Yahweh et Gerecha. There's so many aspects of love in our lives. Which, by the way, as a side point, I'll just point out that the Gemara says that there are moments when, the Medrash says, there are moments when a parent names their child, which is like a little shtickle of prophecy still in this world. The moment they're deciding to name the baby, somehow angels come down, push you out of the way, drop in the name, it comes out of your mouth, right? I'm sure if you look closely at the father, the minute the rabbi says, and he says, and the name is, right, the name comes up, and then he goes back to who he was. So that moment, if you could capture that, that's when the angel did override, whoop, and popped out the name. So there is this like prophetic moment when the parent names a child, which I find very beautiful, because one of the great Amoraim of the Gemara, Rebbe Zera, named his son Love. So that's what made me think about that. He understood it. He understood what it took to connect and make the Torah come together. So here's another very important thing. Now that is basically a new, maybe hopefully insight into looking at Chumash, looking at to how we can break down the process of the 5 books into our own lives. These 5 books are opposite the 5 worlds that God created as well, but we're not going to go into that here for sure. And now we're going to come back and to sort of apply it to ourselves. how does my own name, how does your name unlock the essence of who you really are? I mean, we mentioned earlier the Shalah, that having that ability to say that name in the next world will open up your database. But how does it really function when we're here in this world? So there's the famous couple of quotes now from Shlomo Melech, one of which it says, King Solomon says that a person who acquires a good name actually acquires themselves. Somehow or another, not how much money you have, not how handsome or how pretty or whatever, but somehow the key to self-fulfillment and meaning in life is your good name. And when it uses this language, it's kind of funny language because it uses the language of acquisition. And when you think of to acquire in terms of relationships, first thing came to my mind is the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, where it says that you acquire friends. Aseh lecha rav, make yourself a rabbi, which Reb Soloveitchik learns means make yourself into a rabbi. Become big enough that you know how to open books and you know how to answer things and so on. And then it says, whatever, you have to acquire friends. So at first it sounds funny. I mean, so how do you acquire friends? You know, I don't know if you saw this, it's been going around in Facebook. There's like a 1940 photo of a bunch of guys in a bar, and the tagline says, "It's on me, a round of the house for everybody but the Jew." Anyhow, so, I mean, is that what makes the friend? Because the guy, you got the money, you're like, you know, you're in Vegas with a big wad, and you just rah, 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 rah. Yeah, for sure, that'll make you a friend as long as that wad is there. That wad is gone. Wait, who are you again? So it has nothing to do really with that aspect of acquiring. And we also know even in Talmudic and halachic language, there are many ways to acquire without money. There's meshicha, pulling something, there's hakbah, lifting something, there's all kinds of ways in which transaction of one state of ownership to another state of ownership happens. So what does this mean, this idea of acquiring friends? It means investing. Investing in them. How much when you're with your friend are you busy talking about yourself? And how much when you're the friend you're busy listening with real interest in what they have to say? Right? You just test yourself, not out loud because it might be embarrassing, especially if